All right. Good morning, everyone. We're starting to let people in. My special guest today is Dewey Branstetter, long known in Nashville for all the various things he's done. Dewey, you were at one point chairman of the school board. Is that right?
Yeah, that was back in the 80s, probably before some of the people who have logged on were even born. I served on the school board from 82 to 93, which hard to believe it's been that long.
And you now serve, you're at Sherrard Rowe, Voigt and Harbison.
Yes, and
you're at that law firm, but you also serve as chair of our Metro Charter. Is it the Charter Review Commission? Is that
Charter Revision Commission?
Charter Revision, yeah.
And I've been doing that for about 15 years. Been chairman, I think, for 9 or 10 now. And proud to say that my father served as chairman of the Charter Revision Commission for over 30 years. So it's kind of in our family that we have an interest in what goes on in Metro. And
you have two sons, so one of them will take over when you.
Well, well, I would love it if either one of them did. They would both be good.
All right.
But I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon. So
okay, well, you can just stay right where you are. Well, we're letting some people on. I know that we've got Councilmember Hancock is on the call. Councilmember Allen is on the call. Councilmember Rutherford is on the call. Councilmember Welsh is on the call. We've got a number of council members getting on. Obviously, because I think people should be and are very interested in the topic that we're going to talk about today. Well, we still got a few minutes as we're letting people in. I usually make fun of the background of where you are. You are not in your office, though. Is that right?
No, this would be the view out of my office where I in it. But if I turned off the background, you would see a crib and some baby toys, probably for our grandson. I'm in a room that was converted to an office during COVID that also serves as a place for our one grandson to stay when he's here. And he spent the night with us last night, so it may be a little messy behind me.
Well, we have grandchildren too. I guess the question is, how bad do you spoil your grandchild?
Oh, it's so much fun to spoil them.
Yeah, and then give them back. Is that the
yes?
You know,
hand them over.
Yeah, and hand it back over. So I try to feed mine sugar, just pure sugar, you know, and then make sure that they're completely riled up, then give them back.
Well, we did have waffles with plenty of syrup this morning. So, and then his folks came and got him. Austin and Catherine came and got him just about 30 minutes ago. So I had to hustle to get ready. Okay.
Well, so anyway, it looks like you're. I'm checking to see if I missed anybody else. So we've got 4 council members, and we may have more jumping on. Again, Councilmember Hancock, Welsh, Rutherford, and Councilmember Berkeley Allen. And Tom Cash just come up. I'm looking through the list. Mm-hmm. Our guest today is Dewey Branstetter, who is chair of the Metro Charter Revision Commission. Dewey, we're really glad you're here. This is a very interesting topic we're going to be talking about today. And you were nice enough to say you would do it. You bring obviously an interesting perspective from the standpoint of being the chair of the Charter Revision Commission. But also, your dad was heavily involved in the creation of the metropolitan government, and there's a lot of history there. And so we'll get into that as well.
Good. He was on both charter commissions, the one in 1958 when it didn't pass, and then the one in 1962 when it did pass, and wrote a substantial portion of the actual document when he was on the charter commissions, and stayed involved and active for, essentially the rest of his life. Well, was very proud of Metro government.
He was one of our great founders, one of the great founding leaders of Nashville and our the way we function today, at least the way we are functioning right now. And so we'll talk about what this possible change may mean. But my first question to all my guests is, tell us a little bit about yourself. Oh. Where did you grow up? What have you been doing all this time? And how did you end up becoming chair of the Metro Charter Revision Commission?
Okay, well, I was born and raised in Nashville. I was born on Darden Place, right down from Hillwood High School. But when I was 6, we moved to a farm in Bellevue where I grew up and where we currently have a piece of property that we live on that adjoins the farm I grew up on. Went to MBA and then went down the road to Vanderbilt undergrad and then around the corner to Vanderbilt Law School. Started practicing law in 1981. Then in 1982, the council or there was an amendment to the charter that called for an elected school board. And not to get too deep in the weeds, but knowing how important education was to my mother and father, both of whom grew up in very impoverished areas, and the only way they got out was through an education, thought that I could contribute and ran for the school board at age 25, was single, was lucky enough to get elected by, I think, 70 votes out of 9,000 that were cast. And that sort of started my political activities. And I had always thought I might run for other office, but ended up serving on the school board for 11 years and decided after that I would prefer to practice law on a more full-time basis. But grew up with charter issues being discussed around our kitchen table. I guess I was 6 when Metro was adopted. And then my dad served on the Charter Revision Commission as chair for many years. And I've actually had a lot of involvement from a litigation standpoint with issues with the charter, particularly for employee benefits. So I've looked at it not only from the standpoint of governance, but also from legal standpoints. And then after my father went off the Charter Revision Commission a few years later, I was asked if I would be willing to serve. And I said, of course I would, and have done it now for about 12 or 13 years. And I think been chairman for 9. I should have gone back and looked at that. But it's a wonderful way, I think, for me to give back to the city for something that I have an interest in. I think I've got some skills and knowledge of the charter. And it's something that historically my family's been involved in. So for a lot of reasons, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity.
Well, let's go back because some people may not remember or may not know the kind of the history of where we were or in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, when your dad would have been involved, and you would have been, 3 or 4 years old or something. But what do you know about what was happening back in the late 50s and 60s? Most people know that obviously there was this, we had a city government and a county government, and then there were discussions about consolidating it into a metropolitan form of government. What was happening back then?
A quick history lesson. In 1953, there was a constitutional convention in Tennessee that changed the Tennessee Constitution to allow for counties to have home rule, where they would have more authority over their operations of their government. And that also set up the enabling legislation so you could consolidate city and county governments into a metropolitan form of government. What was happening in Nashville at the time was there was beginning to be a move out of the Nashville city limits into the suburbs. Sales tax was one of the main ways that government was funded, and property tax too. But as people moved out of the downtown and the city limits of Nashville into Davidson County, and shopping moved into that area. Green Hills Shopping Center was being built, and as those tax dollars flowed out of the city and into the county, it took tax base away from the cities. The county, on the other hand, didn't have fire protection. They had a sheriff with just a minimal number of deputies. There was no sewer service. Water service was spotty. And so you had a city with a diminishing tax base, a growing county without the ability to fund and pay for essential city services. So it was just a natural consequence to say, how do we solve this problem? And fortunately, a group of people had the foresight to say, if we combine the city and the county, we can be able to offer more services. We can spread the tax base out. You won't have competition between the city and the county. At that time, there was a city school system, a county school system, a city police force, a sheriff and his deputies. So you had a lot of duplication of services too. So the idea was we can have efficiency of government and be able to provide services if we combine the city and the county. And fortunately, that's what was done.
So obviously, if you have a city government and a county government, you had lots of people that were serving in city government and lots of people that were serving in county government. And you know, the understanding I always had was that, you know, when you bring the two together, you had to figure out what to do with the bodies in order to say this is a good thing. You know, you look at the logical part of it. It's like, yeah, it makes sense to do it. But then you have a lot of people who are interested or are interested in the outcome because they're either on elected government officials or they have jobs within that system. Tell me what you remember about the actual individuals that would have been impacted by the merger, like the county officials and the city officials particularly.
Yeah, there was a city council and a city mayor at the time that it was consolidation was being considered. Ben West was the city mayor. Then you had in the county, you had at that time they called him a county judge. Now they would be referred to as a county mayor. You had Beverly Briley. And in addition to the mayor, the county mayor, you had 52, they referred to them as magistrates. Now they would be county commissioners. So you had about 70 elected politicians between the city and the county. And part of the, I think, impetus for having such a large council in Nashville was when the charter was first proposed in 1958. It called for a 21-person council, and it failed. And when the Charter Commission came back together to consider a new charter, the idea was if we expand the number of elected officials, then this will help us generate support among those politicians who are not, maybe think, well, now I will continue to have an opportunity to serve. If there's only 20, may not have a good chance of serving, but if there are 35 and 5 at large, that increases the likelihood that each local politician might be able to retain some base of power. That may not be the best reason in the world to have such a large council, but it was one of the considerations. Another consideration was the ensuring that you have minority representation. And if the council districts were too large, then the likelihood of having minority districts would be, it would be harder to elect minorities. And one of the things that was going on too, interestingly enough, in the city and the county back in the late 50s, as the suburban areas grew and people moved outside the city limits, the population of Davidson County became larger minority, and then in the county you had larger, a larger white population. So that was also created some tension, and of course that was a time when there was quite a bit of racial tension, and so the thought was by combining and having small enough districts, you would allow minority representation to continue in the new city council.
All right. So the initial, and you may not know this, that when the initial 21 was voted on, and that would have been part of that initial vote on the consolidation, which failed, was it 21 council districts, or were there any at-larges in that part?
I think there were. I think it was 21 districts, but I'm just not. I should know that, but I just don't recall. It might have been 18 districts and 3 at large.
Okay. And what about, and when they came up with the idea of 40, do you know how they came up with that idea? Obviously, I had always thought that they took about the same number of elected positions and just merged them. But you're telling me that there were 52 county officials, representatives. So, and then you take the city folks, you add that together, you've got over 70.
Mhm.
Do you have any idea how they came up with the
You
number
know,
40?
I don't know how the number 35 was ultimately determined. That's a really good question. I wish I could tell you, but I don't know how they came up with 35 and 5 at large. How that, those exact numbers. Why not 32 and 37? I just don't know.
Well, 35, I think, is a prime number. I believe that's right. No, 35 is not a prime number.
Yeah.
But it's but if you're dividing it, because there's 7 times 5 equals 35. But if you're dividing it, you can't divide it by 2. You can't divide it by 3. You've got as you're looking at what's being proposed, it's like, well, who's coming up with these numbers and how do they make sense? So obviously we're not sure of how we came up with the 35 plus 5.
Mhm.
I had always been told, Dewey, that I think there was a feeling that the 5 at large would kind of, the districts would really focus in on their districts
Mhm.
and vote the way their districts were, but you wanted 5 that were kind of overall looking at the overall interest of the city as a whole. Is that supposed to be the right argument?
Yes, that's very accurate. In fact, the way that I remember my father talking about it is that the 5 at large would be the protectors of the entire city, so that if individual council people were doing things that maybe were not appropriate, that you would have the council at large step in and orient toward what's in the best interest of the entire city, not just maybe what's in the best interest of your individual council district. Now, I will say, my father used to comment that it did not work the way as well as it had been hoped that it would. Everybody's probably heard the term councilmanic courtesy, where if one councilman in a particular district wants to do something, then the rest of the council will look at it and say, well, this is your district and you were elected, and so we will defer to your judgment. And I think that on a number of occasions, I remember my father saying that the councilmanic courtesy even flowed over to the at-large council folks, and that there wasn't a overview of what's always in the best interest of the city. Not that it didn't work well, but not exactly the way that I think it was anticipated, having those 5 at-large members.
Well, and we may have to have a whole nother show on councilmanic courtesy and where it is. Because you're right. I think I understood it to be, and I still understand it sort of to be this way. If a council member does in their own district, if they have their public meetings, they work the zoning bills, you have this belief, this trust in that they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're really listening and they're working hard. Council members should have confidence that they know what's going on in the district. I think the councilmanic courtesy is always at risk when I think what your dad was talking about was, what if the council member district or the district council member is not doing what they're supposed to? And how do the at-larges come in and play? But there's only 5 of them. And now everybody says district council members are going like, get out of my district. I've got this. I don't know. There's still a lot to learn.
It's there arguments both ways. And as you say, if the district council person has gone out, particularly on zoning matters, I think that's where it comes up most often. If they've had the public hearings, done their due diligence, and have determined that something is appropriate to be rezoned or not be rezoned. I know if I were a council person in another district, you would naturally defer to that person. And politically, why would you stick your nose into somebody else's district? They may come and stick their nose into your district the next time. So there's just a natural inclination to say, you do what's in your district's best interest, and you leave me alone and let me do the same in my district.
Why do you think? I think Nashville is a model of how a metropolitan government should work. But there's a lot of other cities in Tennessee and around the country and cities and counties that didn't do this. Why not? I mean, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense to do it because you're saving money and you're consolidating everything so it's easier to find. You don't duplicate services.
Turf wars is the main thing. And distrust of quote unquote larger government. I'll give you a great example. 5 years ago, there was an attempt to consolidate Clarksville and Montgomery County, which would have been a wonderful thing, I think, for both Clarksville and Montgomery County. They formed a charter commission. I served as an advisor to them in a limited capacity based on the amount of time that I had. They only had one city incorporated in the county, so it would have been an easy thing to consolidate. They had lack of services in the county. You had zoning issues in the county. For a lot of reasons, it would have made sense for Clarksville and Montgomery County to do that. But I think it passed in the city, but failed in the county by like 80%. And the concern was loss of power in the county. And the concern was raising of taxes on the people in the county if the city expanded to cover them. But in the long run, I think it would have been a much better thing for them. And I think one of the reasons why Nashville has been such a successful city is because we have a consolidated form of government. We don't have a city and a county and those duplication of services and inefficiencies and turf battles. You can look at it as a whole and decide, what's going to be in the best interest of the entire county.
There are, I think, 2 other counties in Tennessee that have a metropolitan form of government. I think it's Moore County and Trousdale.
Yes, Hartsville, Trousdale County, and Lynchburg, Moore County, which are tiny. They're 2 of the smallest counties in the state.
And they, and I don't know this, I don't know if you know this either. Did they follow us as metropolitan forms of government? And the reason I'm asking that is at some point the legislature passed statutory provisions that allowed for Nashville and Davidson County, I believe, to become a metropolitan form of government. Okay, so they laid it out in the statute, and they actually said you can pass a charter which regulates kind of how the whole thing works, including the size of your governing body and things like that. So, I guess what I was asking was whether we were the entity that started that process.
Yes. Nashville, Davidson County was first, and I can't remember exactly when Moore County and Trousdale County became metropolitan governments, but it's been within the last 20 or 25 years.
Yeah, okay.
It was some time after Nashville was formed that those 2 counties decided to combine.
All right. So the Nashville and Davidson County voted in the early 60s to formulate a metropolitan form of government. Took 2 tries, but they did it. And then the Metropolitan Council was created with 40 members, 35 districts and 5 at large. With a mayor to run the city and a vice mayor to kind of oversee the council operations. And we've been doing that since 1965?
They took office in 1963.
63, so, okay.
Yeah, so 60 years.
So, okay, so almost 60 years we've been doing it. There was, I know at least one attempt to decrease the size of the council. That was in 2015. Was there any other times where there was actually a vote on this that you know of?
I don't recall if there was an actual vote. I know there have been charter amendments proposed in the past to reduce the size of the council, but I can't recall whether they actually made it on to the ballot or not. I know in 2015, there was an attempt to reduce the size of the council, and tied with that was extending term limits by 1 more term. Right now the mayor and the and the council folks are limited to 2 4-year terms. And not to get off topic, but and I'm sure the council people who are on the program could tell you, it takes a couple of years to really understand the metro budget and the process and get to know the department heads and the various officials. And in my opinion, 2 terms it's not good for the city. you could argue that there should be no term limits, but 3 terms, 12 years, I think would be entirely appropriate. So the thought was to tie extending term limits by 1 more term to reducing the size of the council to generate support for it. And I think a lot of people that voted for it, reducing the size of the council, were probably also motivated by extending the term limits, but it did not come particularly close. I don't know what the vote was, but it was not a particularly close vote.
All right. So at least on one occasion, we have the city has voted. I say it's twice because obviously they voted for a 40-member council back in the 60s. And then in 2015, they voted to maintain that 40-member council the way it was. But leading up to what's happening now, and you sort of mentioned it, I know that there has been talk over the years, and there may have been talk. I just heard recently there was talk that people said we should have done it very quickly after we included the 40 members and got the government consolidated. We should have quickly switched over to a smaller council because that's what maybe many of the people thought should be we should have in the first place. From your knowledge, there has been efforts, not just in 2015, but people have talked about this for a long time, about decreasing the size of the council. Tell us what you know about that. I mean, did it come from various interests, or were there concerns about efficiency or whatever?
Yeah, I think there are several lines of thought. I know in the past there were lobbyists and people who were interested in particular projects within Metro that felt like having to deal with 40 council people was just too many, and it would be easier to deal with a smaller number. Just curiously, I know one mayor used to say that with a 40-member council, I can always find 21 votes. And then I remember another mayor saying it's impossible to get 21 votes because you have to deal with 40 people and you just don't have the time to deal with everybody. So maybe the fact that those kind of opposing ideas are out there is a good thing for a council of that size. The other thoughts have been that you could have a more, what I guess, quote unquote, professional council, pay them more, have a larger staff. That if you had a smaller council, that you could put more money into resources for the council, because right now, as you know, you make a nominal amount, you have no money for staff, and in that situation, oftentimes it's easier for the department heads and the folks who are employed by Metro perhaps to have more influence than they would if you had a smaller council with a larger staff that was beholden to the council, not to the mayor, perhaps, who appointed them. So there have been discussions that it's just unwieldy to have 40 and that it would be easier to deal with the smaller council. I will say that my dad used to say he wasn't sure that a 40 council initially was a good idea, but at the end of the day, he thought it worked pretty well, that you had an opportunity for people to be closer to their individual constituents, and that overall that process, whether you had 40 or 35 districts or 25 districts or 30 districts, it had worked well for what it was able to do.
Well, I think we've gotten, I mean, it is what it is. We were given when I ran for a district seat, it was 40 members. We just knew it was 40, and you made it work. Vice mayors knew it was going to be 40. So did the mayors that ran. You just had to do it. But obviously in the last couple of years that I guess there has been more confrontation, and this conversation between you and me and people listening, not supposed to be, I'm not going to blame anybody or yell at anybody or anything else. It's supposed to be more information gathering. But obviously there has been more divisiveness, and there's been a lot of as the state has gotten more Republican, more red, and Davidson County is a blue city. There's been more interaction, not through communications, but in terms of legislation.
Not in a positive way, perhaps.
Yeah, well, there's legislation that maybe the city doesn't like, and then the city will pass something, and the legislature will preempt it and things like that. So the relationships have not been all that good. Not to say that, and that's not to blame anybody. That's just to say that we can all do better when we deal with communication. But obviously, some things have happened recently, and all of a sudden we have this piece of legislation. So we're going to turn the discussion to this thing. It's House Bill 48, Senate Bill, I think it's 87. Joyce McDaniel put the link up to the bill. And the bill, to summarize, basically is telling the state legislature is telling metropolitan governments, which basically is Nashville, because we have a larger council than the other two, that we can't have any more than 20 members. And in order to achieve that, they're leaving it up to us to figure out how we're going to do it, whether we have 17 districts and 3 at large, whether we just have 20 council districts. We have to figure that out. And then they extend the term of our council members 1 year. So instead of a 4-year, which is supposed to end this August, it actually ends next year, next August. And I think the feeling is that we might need more time to pull this together. So they're giving us an extra year. So that kind of in summary, along with the fact that I think they would say the term limits start all over again with these new districts. So if you ran and got elected whenever next year, you could sort of, everything starts afresh.
Yeah, start over.
Yeah, start over. I think part of the question is, I mean, so generally, what are your thoughts on this type of thing? Okay. Everything from the state telling us how to do it to, let's say that it passes, and they certainly have the votes to pass it. What about this thing?
Well, there, in my mind, there are really two separate issues. One is a 40-member council the right thing to do, or should it be smaller? And the debate or the discussion you and I were having earlier, but that should be a decision for Davidson County, not for the state. So let's set that aside, whether 20 is better than 40 or 40 is better than 20. The fact that the state has decided to step in, and it's no secret, the legislature's mad at Nashville because we didn't support bringing the Republican National Convention to Nashville. And this is a way to poke us in the eye. And I think they're pure and simple. There's no other explanation for it. It's being couched in terms of efficiency in government. Well, what happened that suddenly caused the legislature to decide, well, now Nashville needs to have a smaller council? So, whether it's a good idea to have a smaller council or not, in my mind, is not the question. The question is what the heck is the state doing, coming in and saying, you've got to reduce the size of your council without really any justification other than we're not happy with Nashville, and so we're going to poke you in the eye. And it's as you say, it's a function of the how divisive politics has become. This is a great example of what happens when you have a supermajority, because the folks in the legislature, they're used to getting their way. They don't have an opposition party that can really hold them up because they've got a supermajority. So now they've got Nashville that did something that they didn't want it to do, which was to not host the Republican National Committee. So they're looking at a way to retaliate. And anybody that tells you it's anything other than that, I think they're being disingenuous.
Well, so we have to, at this point now, okay, so I get that point. And Councilmember Hancock was correct. She sent a note in. It says we can be up to 20. We could actually be lower than 20. We just have to pick the number. The problem with that is that, in my mind, looking at what happened, almost 60 years ago, and looking at this council today, it's like, okay, how do we, if this thing were to pass, how are we supposed to figure this thing out?
Well, That's one of the issues, because it doesn't mandate a 20-person council. It says
Right.
no more than 20, which very conveniently, Moore and Trousdale counties have, I think, 16 and 20 are the sizes. So it doesn't impact them at all. Those two counties won't have to do anything. And that was not coincidental. I'm sure that they picked the number 20 so that it would only force Nashville to do something. But one of the questions is, how do you determine that? Does it take a charter amendment to comply with the state law? And what happens if you say, if the council votes and it goes on the ballot that there's going to be 17 districts and 3 at large, and the public rejects it? So then what do? You have to have another vote. Obviously, I think a lot of this has not been thought through very carefully by those people who have proposed this, but it's just fraught with problems as to even initially, how do you determine what that number should be? And I mean, how ridiculous is it to say, now we're going to extend the terms of the current folks another year? Well, what about, Mayor Cooper or Matt Wilshire or Freddie O'Connell or Sharon Hurd or whoever else has announced that they're running for office, and they're out there raising funds to do that? People who are running for district council, folks who are running for council at large, or the council at large who can run again, you're out there trying to raise money and run a political campaign, and now you may have to extend your term another year. It just doesn't make any sense. You talk about something that is going to create inefficiency in government. Instead of this being the efficiency in government bill, I think it's more aptly the inefficiency in government bill.
Well, I know that we have some council members that, and I remember, I served 2 terms as a district council member, and remember that this is a part-time council. They're not paid full-time, they're paid part-time, and so the majority of them work, and so it's hard. I mean, it's there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of meetings, a lot of evenings that run it, where you have to have your meetings because you're working during the day. And so when you get to that 7th and final 8th year, you're tired. Mm-hmm. And you're fighting, you can see the end of the term. And then maybe you run for an at-large or whatever if you're a district council member. But a number of people will come off. They've served their 8 years or whatever, and they're gonna get off. So it does create some confusion, because if you go from an 8th year to a 9th year, that's not what people voted on. They voted for a 4-year term. Yeah. And that's what the council members thought they were going to do. So there's been concerns expressed that some might resign, and then we might have to have some special elections, which would be under costly. This for 1 year and costly. Mm-hmm. Or do people finally just say, I only agreed to serve 8 years, and I'm not going to resign, but I got other things that I was planning on doing, or I've got things that I've got to go do that I was planning on. I've been holding off, and I've got stuff to do. So I don't know how that works. I've never heard of extending terms just because that makes sense for purposes of trying to create something new. Maybe it has happened. I think I read somewhere where maybe it's happened before to some extent. But I don't know. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No, I'm not aware of it. And again, that's unless there's just a really good reason to do something, which there is not here. I mean, again, it's just we're going to take after Metro because they didn't do something we wanted them to do, and to create those kinds of issues of 1, extending terms, 2, how do you decide what the ultimate size is, and the process for implementing that. It's really unfortunate. I think it's a shame that in my mind, the legislature has better things to do than worry about the size of the council in Nashville. And I find it a little hard to believe that a majority of the constituents of the sponsors of this legislation really care about it. Now, there's a base out there, I'm sure, that's going to say, oh, this is great. We're getting back at that liberal city, that blue dot in the sea of red. But I think anyone who is thoughtful would look at this and say, why propose this? And why now? How is this going to be more efficient? And the the quotes that have been at least reported in the local paper from the House sponsor saying that it seems that it would be more efficient, or that this is too large a number and smaller councils get along better and they're more concerned and they're not going to spend your tax dollars unwisely if it's a smaller council. I'd love to see the empirical data that supports that, because I don't think there is any. I think it's just pure and simple. Let's just get after Nashville because we can. And they probably got the votes to do it. Now, whether it's at the end of the day would be legal and constitutional, I can't tell you. If in the initial enabling legislation that allowed metropolitan forms of government, unquestionably, the legislature could have said, you will be governed by a body no larger than 20, 25, 22, whatever number they picked. To come back and do it now on the back end, to me, there are probably some arguments as to why, if this bill were to pass, it would not be constitutional or legal. I don't know those. I've not researched it from that standpoint. I'm sure there are smarter minds than mine who are out there looking at it, and I hope they are. But it just doesn't make sense at this point in time to try to do something like this.
So let me ask you a question that Councilmember Allen threw out, and that was, and this gets to another concern. I mean, we have a charter. It's what you mentioned. I mean, that enacting legislation years ago said, if you want to do this, pass a charter that says certain things, and they're all listed, including the size of your council body and the terms. So the city has voted on and said 40 members. The state legislature is now coming in and saying, okay, you can't have any more than 20. So if the bill passed and we went to 20 members of the council, we would be in direct violation of the charter. So the charter would say 40, the state legislature would say 20, and then we would, let's say we come up with 20. That's one of those things that makes, then we put it on the ballot for a constitutional change that said we're going to have 20 and whatever. And the city votes it down.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do in that? And where do you go at that point? Because clearly the legislature does have some authority over how metropolitan governments are formed. There's no question about that. I mean, the counties are a creature of the state legislature. They're created by the legislature. They're to a large extent governed by the legislature. One of the issues, and again, not to get too much into ancient history, but before 1953, the legislature could come in and change salaries for county employees and city employees. They could change pension funds. They could oust officials. And then in 1953, there was an amendment to the state constitution. It's called the Home Rule Act that said that counties adopting home rule would have much more authority over the operations of their form of government, and the legislature couldn't come in and do what's called a statewide act of local application, meaning they couldn't come in and just pass a law that says, okay, in Davidson County, you've got to do A, B, and C. They could pass a law that would cover the entire state, and if it impacted that county, then that would be the way you got around it. And that's what they're doing here. They're not saying, Nashville, you have to have a council of 20 people. What they're saying is any city, any county with a metropolitan form of government can have a governing body no larger than 20 members. Well, nobody but Nashville has a governing body larger than 20 members. But so there's, in my mind, there's a question of, does this somehow violate the Home Rule Act? Is it a statewide bill that's really for local application? And I'm sure there are folks that will be looking at whether this whole thing is legal to begin with, apart from all the policy arguments about why it's a crazy idea. But there may be some legal arguments that would stop it too. And I would hope at the end of the day, this really doesn't get very far, that the people who have proposed that they're going to have their fun, they're going to stir the pot, they're going to cause you to have people like me on talking about it. And then at the end of the day, they'll say, well, we had our fun, and it really doesn't matter whether Nashville has a 20 or member council or a 40 member council. But if past performance is no guarantee of future results, but given what's happened with minimum wage and some of the things that the city has tried to do, fair housing and other protections of minorities that the legislature has overturned, I wouldn't put it past them.
Well, let's put a couple of things out on the table. One is obviously they have super majorities in both the House and the Senate. And so, it's if they certainly have the votes they hold together and decide that they really want to do it, they can do this. I think the question would be, okay, so suppose that, I guess this is all hypothetical. Suppose they pass the bill as is, and there's a legal challenge or whatever, and the legal challenge fails. So then you have to figure out how you do this. And I guess one of my questions would be, since this is it's charter territory, because we did it 60 years ago, and it took a while to figure it out. Now we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? And what concerns me is that I don't know how, I'm not exactly sure how you figure this out, because there are going to be people still fighting and saying we should be 40, yet the state law, and again, this is a hypothetical, are saying, no, it's got to be 20 or less. I don't know if you bring together a group of people that then start trying to figure out what is it that we should have. It's almost like reinventing it.
Yeah.
Now, go ahead, and then I got a follow-up question.
Yeah, well, you raise a really good question, because how do you determine the size? And the way the legislation's written, it says that the current council people will serve until their successors are elected. So let's say we go through a process, and there's the Metro Council and the Charter Revision Commission and citizens groups get together and say, okay, we want 17 districts and 3 at large. And then that fails. Well, then you've got to start over. And during the interim, those people who are currently in the positions under the state law, as I understand from my reading of it, they would continue to serve. So what happens if this process takes 2-3 years? Do you just extend those people's terms? And how does that impact on term limits, where you're only supposed to serve 2 4-year terms? Is that a mandatory, maximum of 8, or are you somehow then in violation of the charter? And does that create other problems? There are just so many unintended consequences from something that has, in my mind, no merit whatsoever. And all you're going to do is create issues that will divert attention away from what we should be talking about. Police protection, fire protection, schools, economic and community development, fair housing, all the other issues that the city should be focusing on. And this will divert attention of a lot of folks who have better things to do than fool with trying to comply with a stupid state law.
Well, at this point, I mean, there's a number of us trying to figure out what to do over the next couple of weeks, because it's my understanding that the bills have both have sponsors. They have both passed 2 readings. They're past second consideration, both the House and the Senate. The governor is being inaugurated this morning, and they'll come back into session not this coming week, but the week after, with not a lot of stuff on their agendas, which means they can pick this bill up and move it fairly quickly. So we have to figure out quickly what, if there's any room to maneuver, whether it's simply going to be a big legal challenge, or whether there's, take the other side at this point. And that is, so I know there are people out there, and I know there are probably council members out there who think that 40 is too large. And that's probably current council members and former council members. Okay, so there was a power poll that just came out that Bruce Dobie and his group does. That they came out with their numbers yesterday, and I saw it, and it was. I think it was a clear majority of people felt that the council was too big. So how do you, forget the state legislation now for a second. If people think the council is too large, I guess this goes back to the citizens themselves voting on it. Do they, is the right thing to do to put together another, like the Charter Revision Commission, or a group of people to say, let's look at what other cities are doing. Let's look at why we're at 40 at the first place, and then try to figure it out on our own.
Well, that's how it should operate. I mean, if there's a groundswell that says we have too large a council, again, it shouldn't be up to the state. If we were starting from scratch, the state law would say you have to have a charter commission that's made up of 10 people from the county, 5 people from the largest municipality within the county. I don't know whether that task would automatically devolve to the Charter Revision Commission to be involved, or whether it would go because we now have a Metro Council, whether the council would have to propose legislation that would then be vetted by the Charter Revision Commission, but would ultimately be the responsibility of the council to determine whether it went on the ballot or not. I think that's the process, but I would like to think that if that is the process, that there would at least be not necessarily a commission but a citizens group or folks who would have input into what the size of the council should be. At the end of the day, if the size of the council is 20, is that going to ruin Nashville? I don't think so. If that had been the size of the council to begin with, it probably Nashville would still be the great city that it is if it had been 21 under the original proposal in 1958. I guess the getting back to the issue that I've got with it is how it's being foisted on us right now, and what would have to happen to make a determination of what size you have, and then how you implement that and what it does to current terms. It's just not it's a horrible way to govern, to have to be in this position talking about how we address it. But the good thing is, if they do it, we'll figure out a way to make it work. That's the Nashville way.
Well, nobody likes being told what to do, by somebody else. And this idea of this was given to the city to figure it out, which it did back in the early 60s, and has figured out a way to make it work. And the city is obviously booming and growing and developing, and lots of great things are all happening here. Maybe the question here is instability, and we've sort of talked about it to some extent. You've mentioned it. There's enough problems going on in the city that need to be addressed, and there's also enough problems going on within the city and the county and the state and the world and the country, whatever, in terms of things that we're having trouble with, and a lot of issues on the table. One of the concerns that has been mentioned to me is about this period of time. If we do have to reconstruct the government, and we've got a charter that's not in connection with what the state now says, and we've got people maybe serving an extra year, and people are thinking they're going to run for a council term this time, but they're not sure when the election is. It gets everything kind of all messed up. How do you see that affecting the city's growth? Because that means that we kind of we're not sure what our government is.
No, it totally diverts attention away from what the city should be focusing on. And it's a disruptor. And I think that's part of the whole reason behind it, is just to disrupt Nashville, create problems for Nashville. And it clearly would, because we would have to be focusing on how do we come in compliance with the state law. And it would be a time-consuming task. And then if you have to have an election, then you have a campaign or on a referendum as to how you would, actually determine the size of the council. And all those things provide, in my mind, no additional value or benefit to the city. And all it does is it pulls resources and the thought process and away from what the city should be concentrating on to do something to reduce the size of the council that at the end of the day probably won't make much difference in how Nashville functions. Nashville's going to be fine whether it has a 40-person council or a 20-person council, in my opinion. But you mentioned a minute ago, people don't like to be told what to do. I would be really interested to hear what the legislature would say. Let's say that the federal government had the authority to come in and say, well, Tennessee, you've got an inefficient system. You've got 99 counties. And the reason you have so many counties, and it was because when the counties were being formed, the idea was they should be no larger geographically than you can ride a horse from the furthest point of the county to the county seat and back in one day. That was how they determined the sizes of counties. So that was part of the consideration. It should be no larger than someone can get on a horse, ride in, transact their business, and get home in one day. Well, clearly with an automobile, you can drive almost the entire state in a day. So what if the federal government came in and said, well, we think you all ought to only have 50 counties, that's more efficient? Well, they'd be screaming bloody murder. But that's exactly what they're doing to Davidson County, saying, well, you should really have a smaller group just because we have the votes and can do it. And just because you have the votes and can do something doesn't mean you ought to do it.
Yeah. Well, this whole thing it's very complicated. And I mean, again, from my standpoint, I worry first about trying to figure this out, particularly when the citizens of Davidson County have voted at least twice on this and said this is what they want, and then trying to change it. And then the second part is, if whatever happens and we have to change it, I'm not sure how we do that. But I also don't know if you can do it in a year. I think it's a problem.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I mean, I think realistically, to do it thoughtfully and do it right. And when this first was proposed, I didn't even think until actually one of your fellow council folks mentioned to me, Bob Mendez mentioned to me, that we'll have to have an election to decide the size, because it doesn't say 20, it says no larger than 20. So that's something that would be part of the home rule issue. So it's just there are a lot of, I think, unintended issues, or maybe they were intended. Maybe that's all part of the whole scheme to disrupt Nashville. But you're right, Jim, that there are a lot of things that probably couldn't be done within a year, given the election laws and how long things have to be on the ballot and when you can call for a special election. And if it didn't pass the first time on a particular size, I mean, there's a part of me that would say, I'm going to vote against every bill that comes up to change change the size of the council, just to, because as a protest. Well, that's probably not in the best interest of the city long term, but I could see a significant portion of the population saying, to hell with the legislature, I'm going to vote against it. We'll keep this thing in flux and we'll show them. Well, that's not good at the end of the day for anybody.
Well, and maybe that's I think we have 2 minutes left. So I was trying to figure out the right question. And I had 2, and now I think I'm going to change to end up on this one. And maybe that's it. It's bigger than all of us. I mean, what we want is a good, sound, functioning government. And I would say to a large extent, it's worked for the last almost 60 years. Doesn't mean that it can't be better. Mm-hmm. But the question is, isn't the citizens that get to decide that?
Yes.
And then the question is, so what do we do? Let's say that the bill doesn't pass. Let's say it just stops. But the issue's on the table. Mm-hmm. Do we look at it and go, well, most places except for New York and Chicago don't have 40-member councils. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should look and throw it up there and see if maybe it does make more sense to have, because then you're talking about a more permanent, full-time council with staff and so forth, stronger council, that type of thing.
Listen, self-examination is never a bad thing. If it's self-examination, not if it's being forced on you the way this is. But let's say you're right, that the bill just stops and the legislature's had their fun with Nashville. It's probably worth looking at there in an orderly way that doesn't pull away resources from what the other more important things perhaps that the city should be doing. And the ultimate decision may be to have a smaller council. I mean, it's, there are arguments that we could spend an entire program, both pro and con, of why a larger council is better or a smaller council is better. Social media has made it easier to connect with citizens. It used to be if you wanted to connect with your folks in your district, you had to have a public meeting, and now it's easier to connect and get polls and get information and feedback. So maybe we don't need 40 people anymore. But how you determine the size and whether it should be smaller than 40, again, should be totally a function. It should come from Nashville and Davidson County and rise up. It shouldn't be forced onto Davidson County by the state legislature.
Well, we are with that. We are out of time. Dewey, I really appreciate you coming on. This is a very interesting issue, and it's very important to the city and to the state. And I think everybody knows that.
Yeah.
And
great.
You've got a very interesting history with it, but you also understand it. So we really do appreciate you being on.
Listen, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on, Jim. Always good to see you.
Well, it's good to see you. I will tell you, the viewers, a couple things. One is that Judge Cindy Chappell will be our guest next week. She's a General Sessions Court, so that should be interesting. Two, Dewey, we may have you back soon, because that's probably the third part, is that this thing, for those of you who obviously are interested in the city, should be interested in this, is this may happen in the next month or so. And so keep an eye on the newspapers, the news, and anything else from the council members. We will be, everybody will be keeping up with this. We'll try to figure out where it's going. And then after this happens, whether it passes or doesn't pass or whatever, Dewey, we may have you come back on, and then we can talk a little bit more about what's going on with that. All right.
Be delighted to, Jim. This is something that interests me.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the weekend. Have a great week next week, and keep an eye on this, and then we'll see you all next week. Everybody be safe. Thanks,
Appreciate
Dewey.
it. See ya.